What I want to talk about today is three general subjects. The first is I want to talk about the kinds of data that people tend to use in the redistricting space. Also that the commission itself may be likely tasked to review when they're going about drawing lines. I understand that some of that part of the presentation will overlap with Karen McDonald's presentation yesterday, but hopefully that'll help to sort of reinforce some of the ideas in your heads, maybe present some new ones. Then I'm going to take some of those same data and talk about trends that have occurred over time, both sort of the longer term trends in California and then some of the shorter term trends that have occurred since the last redistricting was conducted. And then to the extent that we have time or bandwidth, I want to talk a little bit about what came out of the last commission, both in terms of how some of these, the earlier, the discussion of demography and so forth, was reflected in what the commission did, and then some of the other things that they did that met their mandate and actually in some ways went beyond that mandate. So for sources of data, I want to talk first about the decennial censuses, which is the most important source of data that is used in redistricting. Then discuss estimates and projections, the distinctions between those two things. Then get into a little bit of a discussion of survey data, the kind of survey data that the census tends to use, and then into other administrative data that will be available in California for drawing the lines, and then discuss the errors that we might see in these data sources, especially in the decennial census, which might be relevant to some of the work that the commission is going to be doing. So why do we take a census? The census is done every 10 years. The primary purpose of the main census is to apportion the House of Representatives. That's in the Constitution. So apportionment is the allocation of congressional districts to the states according to their population. And the formula for doing that is really a relative population formula. It reflects how much a state has grown relative to other states. So just because a state gains population does not mean it will gain representation. Just because it loses seats doesn't mean that it shrank in population. It means that it didn't grow as much as other states did over the previous 10 years. That formula has been in place since roughly in its current form since the late 1920s. Before that, the House tended, it would expand the number of seats generally with each census, and it was a much more ad hoc process for apportionment. Now it's much more formalized through a formula. And so the census takes its numbers and it plugs them through the formula, and that's your apportionment. The census data are also used to draw political districts. That's what the commission is going to be tasked to do, to redraw the lines within the state of California. Now, the census does not have to be technically the source of that line drawing. So you could technically use some other source. The legalities of that are a little ambiguous. I'll talk in a minute about why that might be something to consider, why the commission may be brought to consider that anyway. But by and large, there's no actual explicit requirement that you use the census data to draw those districts. The reason the census data are used is because they're the only source that is detailed enough to allow the districts to be drawn to equalize population. So the US Supreme Court has mandated that districts be equal in population, and the way that that is typically done is at every census, you redraw the lines with the census data, and you try and achieve that equality to a very high degree of precision. So for state legislative seats, there's a little bit of wiggle room, and for lower offices, there's a little bit of wiggle room. For US Congress, typically you wouldn't have the districts deviate more than a few people. Not percentage points, but people, individual people. So you try and get it almost exactly equal in terms of the census data. To do that, you need very detailed geographic estimates of population, and that comes from the census. Beyond those representational issues, the census is also used to disperse a variety of federal funds. A lot of money is potentially on the line. There are formulas that use population and determine how money is distributed. And then beyond that, just the census provides a broad portrait of our nation. It's used by researchers, it's used by businesses, a wide range of people to try and understand what our country looks like. What are the goals and the methods of the census? Well, the main goal is very simple. Count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. So that sounds very simple. It can be complex. People, if you think about it. So first of all, the way that the census does that is it sends out a form to the households, and somebody in the household responds for everyone in that household, and serves as what you call an informant, which has a more sort of sinister meaning outside of survey research, but an informant is just somebody who provides information about somebody else. And so that's the way the census is constructed, which means, of course, that that person may not be an accurate informant for the other people in the household. They may not want to reveal that somebody is in the household because they're illegally for some reason. Maybe they themselves are in the country illegally and don't want to reveal that, and so they don't respond to the census, which means that somebody who is in the household legally is also not reported to the census. Also, people move around, right? People have multiple addresses. Homeless people have no address. It creates challenges for the count, and the census has worked very hard to try and overcome those challenges, but those challenges remain nonetheless. But their goal is always to say, okay, as of April 1st of, in this case, 2020, what's the population of the United States, and where are those people? The questionnaire for this main census is just a few questions. Really broad brush stuff: name, age, race, ethnicity, gender, do you own or rent your home, etc. It's a lot of detail that we get out of the census that doesn't come from the main census itself. That's important to understand. There also recently has been a controversy about adding a citizenship question to the census, because again, like the main census form itself is relatively short. It's meant to not be too much of a burden for the people who are responding to it, because you want to have every household respond, right? The goal, and that's another important point here, is that the census is an actual enumeration of the population. It's not a sample. You want to count absolutely every single person, everyone, right? Not just sort of a representative chunk of those people, but everyone. And adding that citizenship question created a lot of controversy because there were concerns that it might affect the response rate to that core questionnaire, and could create issues with some of if you had somebody who didn't respond and somebody in their household was a citizen, you would not only depress the response rate for somebody who was an immigrant, say, who was afraid of being deported because of the citizenship question, but also a citizen who was in the household who was not reported to the census as a result. So monkeying with the underlying questionnaire for the main census is a big deal. And you can see that in the way that it created a big controversy and then eventually didn't happen. And I'll talk a little bit about what's going to be done instead in a minute. So that's the main census. You also have efforts to try and get at the characteristics of the population in between censuses and beyond the current census. Estimates are the effort to figure out the population between censuses. It's a look back, or sort of a current look, usually. Projections are where you're looking into the future. You're saying, here's where we are now, here's where I think we may be going in the future. Both the US Census Bureau and the California Department of Finance produces both the estimates and projections. The estimates are always based on the main decennial census count, and then that's updated with recent administrative data on births, deaths, migration. Just trying to adjust those basic numbers to account for all those three components of change, of population change. Projections then also have to add in assumptions about future fertility, mortality, and migration rates. They can't work with the ones that have actually occurred. They have to try and project what those might be in the future, and so they are necessarily more uncertain. Regardless, the Department of Finance and the Census Bureau currently are matching quite closely in terms of their estimates. These are the estimates plotted since 2010. And you can see up until about 2016, they were really quite close, and they've begun to diverge just a little bit. But in the past, they have sometimes diverged a lot more than this. So this is actually a pretty close correspondence, historically speaking. So right now, whether you rely on the Department of Finance or on the census, you're going to get a roughly the same guess at the California population, which is that it's currently about maybe a little north of 39 million. Projections, because there's more inherent uncertainty to them, can sometimes diverge. Here I just grabbed 3 different projections. The top blue line is from USC in 2012. Then you can almost not tell the difference between the next two, but there's a red line there that is the Department of Finance from 2016. And then the University of Virginia also provides a projection, and they have numbers for 2018. And you can see that all those, the last two, the Department of Finance and UVA, both line up very closely, but it is possible to get a divergent result. Possibly it's USC was working with earlier data, so their projections kind of got off track a little bit compared to the others, which tells you that things do change. If you have more recent data, you're going to get a more accurate result in your projection. It's worth noting that the US Census does not provide state-level projections. They provide projections for the nation as a whole by different racial and ethnic groups, but they don't provide the state-level estimates. So we've got the main census itself, efforts to sort of fill in the gaps between those censuses since they're only conducted every 10 years. Then survey data. The main surveys of the US population that the Census Bureau conducts are the Current Population Survey and the American Community Survey. Both of these are surveys in the sense that they are a sample of the broader population. It's a very large sample. For people who work in public opinion research, these samples are just mouthwatering. They're enormous, but nonetheless much smaller than the basic enumeration, or the decennial enumeration. The Current Population Survey is a monthly survey that is where the data for each month are released. It really focuses in on the labor market. It's the source of the main source of our unemployment figures. The American Community Survey is a more kind of wider ranging thing. Also conducted monthly, but the numbers are released annually and over multiple years. So annually it samples about 3 million households. That's a lot, right? So it's a very big survey. The items that are covered, and there's a wide range of topics. The items that are covered are similar to those of what was called the long form questionnaire of the 2000 and earlier censuses. So the census used to send that short version that I just described to you to everyone. And then there was a sample of people who received a much longer version that had more detailed information and opportunities to provide information about things like citizenship. The census decided to do a sort of an ongoing survey of a smaller size to be able to keep track of things at a more detailed level. The ACS started in 2002, but really became, filled out all the details and got the most accurate picture of the population starting in 2006, and it's been conducted ever since. And as such, it replaced the long form of the census. So in 2010, there was no long form. It was just the 2010 ACS. The ACS covers a wide range of topics. And I'm zeroing in on the ACS because I think it's more likely that the commission will use the ACS for its work than will use the CPS, though the CPS is there as a resource if they want it. It has demographic characteristics, income and employment, transportation, education, origins and languages, including citizenship, migration, stuff about housing, et cetera. Just a lot of different things. A lot of what we think of as census information actually does not come from the decennial census. It comes from the ACS at this point. So what are the advantages? Well, it's compared to the Current Population Survey for sure. it's a very large sample. It's 3 million households instead of 60,000 households. Now again, like I said, 60,000 households to somebody who would just conduct a public opinion survey is so massive they can't even imagine it. A typical public opinion survey, like there's been surveys of the Democratic primary that have as few as 300 people, right? So this is a lot of people that they're sampling, but it's still smaller than 3 million. The data of the ACS are much more timely than the decennial census, so that's useful, helping to sort of understand how the population has changed in the meantime. And it covers all of those topics, lots of different stuff. It's a really great portrait of our nation on many different dimensions. It does have limitations, though. Compared to the census, it's not an enumeration. It's not a count of the entire population. It's a sample. And it's small relative to the decennial census, and also small relative to the long form that the census used to use. So the long form went to 1 in 6 households. The ACS goes to 1 in 40. It's also a moving average rather than a single point in time. So it's conducted monthly, but then the information is released annually. So, for instance, there's information about employment in the ACS, but employment can vary quite a bit month to month, especially if a recession hits. And the ACS won't capture that nuance, right? The better source of that would be the CPS. If you're going to go down to a really detailed geographic level, like census tracts or census block groups, and I gather, Carr and McDonald talked a little bit about that hierarchy yesterday. That's going to be based on 5-year estimates, combining multiple years of the ACS, because you just don't have enough in any single year. And of course, that obviously means that you're smoothing out that change over time and losing a lot of that detail, that nuance. So because of that, it really can't be used for redistricting because it's not detailed enough. You need that really, really fine-grained detail, and the ACS, as large as it is not detailed enough to do redistricting. Plus, it's worth noting that it is still pegged to the census estimates. The census does these estimates where it's updating its numbers based on birth, death, migration, et cetera. The ACS is weighted to match those estimates. So there's a long shadow of that original decennial census that lasts throughout the rest of the remaining decade. If that original census is bad, the ACS will be bad in roughly the same way. So finally, for California, there are a variety of administrative sources that might be useful. The commission is tasked with respecting communities of interest, and there are a variety of ways that they could define that. That's kind of, there's a definition in the law, but there's also a lot of flexibility for the commission as well. So the statewide database, which has voter registration election outcomes. Carr McDonald actually is the director of that statewide database. The California Department of Education has school demographics and test scores. The California Employment Development Department, the EDD, has its own source of unemployment rates, information about occupations. And there are a variety of other private sources that I think the commission should be allowed to look at if they want to, in order to understand a more nuanced portrait of the country, of the state, excuse me. So these are all the sources of information. These sources are not perfect. Even the decennial census is not perfect. So the census has what they call a post-enumeration survey, where they go after the fact, after the census has been conducted, and they re-interview. They do a sample, a very large sample, but a sample nonetheless, of blocks around the country, and they go and they re-interview those blocks, and they see if they get a different result. And then they use that information to estimate how far off their census count is from the truth. And by this metric, they also incidentally use the estimates that they develop. That's called demographic analysis. They use those estimates for the same purpose. So there's a little bit of a war within the census about which one is the best one to use. You use the demographic analysis or you use the post-enumeration survey. But in either case, California typically looks worse by this metric. So when the census is, when there's an undercount, when people are missed, but an undercount meaning people are missed by the census, it tends to happen more often in California than in the rest of the country. And so it just shows you in the last 3 censuses, we were consistently below that main count. Those undercounts vary by county. The most important takeaway from this graph, this is from the 2010 census. These are raw numbers. Most important thing to pick up from here is that there's a handful of counties that are going to have the biggest impact on that undercount. They're all pretty much down south: Orange County, Riverside, San Bernardino. They're big counties, and they tend to have the kinds of populations that get missed. There are particular concerns about the census that is approaching. So first of all, there have been concerns for a while about funding challenges. Some of that has been addressed, so Congress has appropriated more money for the census to be conducted, and so that concern is lessened somewhat. But it's still kind of out there because the resources weren't necessarily available when they were preparing for the census. The census's own research has shown that there's a general distrust that suggests response rates to the census this time may be lower than in the past across a broad cross-section of society, just that people are not as likely to want to respond to something the government sends them. They're also doing, as a response in part to the funding challenges, the census is also conducting an internet survey for the first time. So for most people who are contacted for the enumeration, their first chance to respond is going to be through the internet. They'll get something in the mail that'll tell them, hey, we want you to respond. It's your civic duty to respond to the census so we can get an accurate count. And then you'll go online and you'll fill in your information there. And they're really hoping that's going to cut down on costs and prevent them from having to go and follow up with as many addresses for people who don't respond. They're also, again, to deal with the funding challenges, they're also going to do more aggressive administrative matching. So they've always done a certain amount of matching to other data sets, but this time they're going to use it much more aggressively to try and fill in information that they're missing. So they're going to go to other sources of information like the Social Security database, for instance, and try and figure out, okay, we didn't get that household, we didn't get a response from that household. First of all, is that household likely to be occupied at all? Do we need to bother with it? If it is occupied, how many people are likely to live there? These kinds of things. And where they have reason to believe that the confidence in that match is very high, they will fill in that information rather than go and try and repeatedly contact that household and get the information from them. They've done a variety of different things to produce the same result in the past. They've always done a certain amount of what's called imputation, where you try and guess at the characteristics of a household that has not responded. There's also a practice of asking neighbors to report on people in a household that aren't responding, which you can imagine that's going to be filled with error, right? So they always try to, if they can't get it directly from the source, from the horse's mouth, then they try to go to other sources and get it from there instead. And this administrative matching is another version of that. There's also just general distrust and specific distrust among the immigrant community, both because of the citizenship question that was discussed but then not pursued, but then also just because there's a general climate of hostility to further immigration and to those who are here undocumented. So there's a concern that they won't respond this time around. Also, the administration is planning to use the administrative matching to try to fill in a citizenship response anyway, even though they didn't get one through, they're not going to get one on the census form itself. They're going to use administrative data, stuff from immigration, stuff from Social Security to try and identify the people who are citizens who are not citizens. It's not clear yet how successful that effort is going to be, but that is their goal. And their goal is to fill it in at a level of detail where citizenship would be attached to every record in the decennial enumeration. So you could actually use citizenship for the purposes of redistricting if you wanted to. So that may be something that the commission will be tasked to decide. The legalities of using citizenship to draw districts rather than total population that's an open legal question. It has not been resolved. So the commission could technically decide they wanted to use the total, to try to equalize the total citizen population, and then see how that went in the courts, because the U.S. Supreme Court has not definitively said that you cannot equalize districts on citizenship instead of population. Also, all these concerns that about the 2020 census undercount, they apply, not all of them, but many of them apply more to California than to other states, which makes sense given the numbers that I showed you earlier about how California is traditionally undercounted. So then we have more immigrants, so the non-citizen distrust is a bigger deal. The funding challenges and the internet survey, we have the kinds of communities that are less likely to respond to the internet. We have that when you don't have good funding for a census, the problems that might result tend to undercount the kinds of communities that we have. These are very young children, African Americans, Latinos, immigrants in general, all those sorts of groups, or the renters. We have a lot of every one of those groups. So that raises a question: what happens if we get the census numbers and it's bad? It's a bad census. This has been a concern that people have. First of all, how would we know that we have a bad census? Well, you could, since the Census Bureau's estimates and the Department of Finance estimates match pretty closely, and even if they didn't, frankly, you could look to those Department of Finance estimates and see how well they compare with what the census comes up with in its decennial enumeration. That comparison is part of the mandate of the Department of Finance, to provide numbers that can be compared. So you can see, like, if it's way off, maybe we have a problem. You can also look, the post-enumeration survey is a very large survey, so it has some very detailed estimates. Again, not all the way down to the block level, but it's a sample of blocks, so it can provide some estimates if you make some assumptions. It can provide maybe some fine-grained enough estimates of undercounts to be able to get a good sense of where those undercounts are, not only whether California has an undercount, but also where those undercounts are likely to be. And demographic analysis from the census, the same thing. So looking at this constellation of information, we give a sense of whether the census was likely to be badly off. And so that raises a question for the commission that the commission, I think, may have to answer, which is, should the state try to adjust for the sake of redistricting, adjust for a bad count? And again, the legalities of that are ambiguous. It's not clear whether it would be acceptable to use some other measure, but it's not clear that it wouldn't be. It would all depend on how bad that census was, and whether you could make the case to the courts that whatever version you were using instead was actually a better estimate of the population for equalizing population across districts than the actual census itself. But it may be something that the commission is going to have to think about and review. So those are the sources of data. What do some of these data sources tell us about demography in California? So I want to talk about three components of that. Just overall change. How has California changed over time, just in terms of its top line numbers? Then racial and ethnic change, which is really the biggest and most significant change that we've seen in California over the last few decades. And then the geographic change that we've seen just since the last redistricting that indicates roughly where representation is most out of whack in terms of the need to equalize population. So California's population growth has slowed a little recently, but it's still fairly large. And you can see that over time, it's been absolutely staggering, especially since World War II, roughly. The growth has just been astounding. And California has typically picked up seats after every apportionment, reflecting the fact that it's growing faster than the rest of the country. Now, I will say 2010 was the first time in California's history that we did not add congressional districts. The one before that, the census before that in 2000, we only added one district. And there is a possibility this time around that we will actually lose a seat. So our growth is slowing. It does not mean that we are not growing, again, because the apportionment formula is a relative thing. So we are growing. We're just not necessarily growing as fast as other states, given how many districts we already have. If that makes sense. This is just an interesting comparison. Shows you that California has actually looks a lot more like Mexico over its history in terms of population growth than it does the rest of the United States. Much faster growth than in the rest of the country. So we're still a large and growing state. Over the last few decades, we've also the complexion of our population has also changed quite a bit. So in the 1970 census, fully 78% of the population was non-Hispanic white. Today, it's 37%. So there's been a tremendous change there. The most of that change is a growth in the Latino population, but there also has been a significant growth in Asian American population and some others besides. So we are a majority-minority state, as they say. That racial and ethnic diversity is everywhere in California. It makes the map of the state sort of a patchwork quilt of different ethnic groups. So you can see that most of the state, first of all, the blue there is non-Hispanic white. You can see that most of the state in terms of geography is majority white. But most of those blue areas are also low in population. The areas that are denser in population, especially I've got blow-ups there for Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area, are a wide range of different ethnicities. The green is Asian American, the purple is African American, the orange is Latino, Hispanic, and you can see it's just kind of, and these are just showing you the majority for each census tract, not necessarily the only one for each census tract. And anything that's white is a census tract where there is no majority, where it's a mixture, and at the best you have a plurality with one group. So there's a lot of diversity here, and I would expect that the map that comes out of the 2020 census would be this even more so, right? So this is because this is from 2010. We have a large immigrant population, foreign-born. Foreign-born meaning could be citizen, have been naturalized to be a citizen, but was born abroad, but also people who are not citizens. You can see throughout our history, we have actually had periods of time where more of our population has been foreign-born in the late 19th century, but that declined rather rapidly going into the midway through last century. It was that immigrant population was very low. And then in the last few decades, it has increased again. Note, however, though, on the last couple bars there at the far right, that that growth has slowed. So we don't actually, our non-citizen population in particular is shrinking. We are not getting a lot of the same rate of new immigrants that we used to. And so that diverse population that I just presented to you is becoming citizen at a fairly high clip. Because the children of many of these people are citizens, and they are, and that's where the growth is. Latin America is still the leading source of immigration. However, if I showed you this same list from the 2010 census, the Latin America category would be a much larger share. So that share has shrunk considerably. Asia is now a rapidly growing share of our immigrant population, and is most of the new immigrants that we're getting right now. So those are the two biggest categories: Latin America and Asia. And our immigrants come from all over the world. So I think the threshold for this was 10,000 people. So each of these countries has at least 10,000 people in the United States, and it's listed in order of number. So Mexico is the largest source, then China, Philippines, etc. But you can see they're from all over the place. Just a really diverse state with a lot of different perspectives. And that makes choosing members of this redistricting commission especially challenging, because it's hard to find 14 people that will represent that level of diversity. And just to flag that majority-minority status. So these are Department of Finance estimates for California for different racial and ethnic groups, and you can see that we have crossed. So there, on the far left is stuff that's already happened. So 2015 has already happened, 2010 has already happened. And we crossed for where non-Hispanic whites are now a smaller share of the population than Latinos, and it's expected to continue that direction, though it will kind of level off in future decades. But that's sort of the trend. That's where we're headed. And as you might expect, based on everything else that I've just shown you, young Californians are much more diverse, much more diverse than older Californians. So those who are, over 65 are still majority white, but the children, only about 20% of very young children are white, or non-Hispanic white, and then the rest are a range of different categories. And you can see that they are actually where a lot of the population is. So we have a lot of young people in the state, and so the demographics of our state are changing rapidly. This has consequences for our representation. So that diversity is not really represented in our electorate. So this is from the statewide survey for run by my institute. And it just compares likely voters versus those who are not registered to vote at all. And you can see there's just a massive disparity there, with over half of likely voters being non-Hispanic white, but over half of those not registered to vote being Latino. A big chunk of that is about citizenship, that there are just, in the not registered to vote category, about half are not citizens. But nonetheless, it shows you that disparity. That becomes a relevant question for deciding how you draw those districts, right? Total population means that the not registered to vote category is more heavily reflected. Basing the districts on citizenship would mean it would weight it more toward the likely voters. And this just gives an example. There's a number, if you ask a wide range of policy questions, the not registered to vote have a different perspective than the likely voters. This is just how big a government do you want? The not registered to vote generally want a larger government than the likely voters do. The final thing is the geographic change that we've seen over since the last census. Again, districts have to be equal in population. So this is just showing the population deviation as it stood in the most recent numbers that we have available. So these are from the ACS, these numbers. However, they are a munging together of 5 years worth of data. So 2013 through 2017 ACS. So again, that smooths over change. This is not going to reflect all the change that has occurred up to 2019, not by a long shot. But you can get a sense of where the change is happening. The biggest growth, so, and these are, the green is areas that are larger. These are districts that are larger in population than equal population would dictate. The red is districts that are below that population. And you can see that the Inland Empire, so Riverside, San Bernardino counties, and the Bay Area are the areas that are growing the most. They're the most out of whack in terms of population. And therefore, because they are larger than that ideal population, they're going to need to be brought back in line by drawing more districts in those areas. And the places that are red will receive, on average, fewer districts in the next time around, less representation. So roughly the same thing is true for the state Senate districts. That was the last one was congressional, and then assembly. always roughly the same pattern. The biggest chunks of growth you see are in the Bay Area and down in the Inland Empire. And again, we don't know exactly what this is going to look like when we see the more recent numbers or the decennial census when it comes, but it'll probably be something along these lines. Worth noting, however, the population deviations are smaller so far this cycle. So the census does release population estimates for the 1 year of the 2017 ACS for congressional districts. So it provides those 1-year estimates just for Congress. And so you can compare the 2017 numbers to where things were in 2007 at the same point in the last redistricting cycle. The blue up and down is the deviations for the districts in 2007, and then the orange is for 2017. You can see that there is more deviation in the last redistricting cycle than in this one. And that likely reflects mostly the fact that mobility, movement, migration has slowed in general in California. It also may, to some extent, reflect the fact that the last set of districts before the current set there were more of them that were sort of strange shapes, convoluted shapes. And that meant there was more border to cross relative to the area of the district. So you might have had more people moving in and out of districts as a result. But probably it's mostly having to do with migration patterns. All right, so those are the demographic trends and patterns. The final thing I wanted to cover was just kind of a post-mortem on the 2011 commission. So you had some sense of what came out of that process. There's two ways that we can do this. One is what I'll call mandated goals, the things that the law requires the commission to achieve. And then the other category is what I'll call aspirational goals, things that the commission technically didn't have to do, but that a lot of people sort of hoped that they would do. So how did they perform on those? So in terms of mandated goals, there's a number of things that the commission had to do. It had to, as I said, first and foremost, equalize population. That's a constitutional requirement. And in the law itself, it's the #1 requirement. So it's the thing that they have to do before they do anything else. It constrains everything else that they do. They had to make their districts compliant with the Voting Rights Act. Now, the Voting Rights Act has changed since the last districts were drawn, and there's fewer constraints now based on a Supreme Court ruling that came down after the last districts were drawn. But the Voting Rights Act is still there. It's still a constraint. It's still something you have to respect and pay attention to. The districts they drew had to be geographically contiguous, which meant that you couldn't have District 1 be over here, and a part of that district be here, and then another part be way over on the other side of the state. They all parts of the district had to touch all other parts. But also compact, that is as close to sort of squares and circles as possible. And then respectful of communities of interest, of communities that had common interests together. And then there was also a requirement for nesting, which is where we have twice as many assembly districts as state senate districts. So to the extent possible, the commission was supposed to embed assembly districts, 2 assembly districts within each senate district. Now I will note that all of these requirements, and then also in addition to all those, they couldn't favor a party or any incumbent. The first 4 bullets are ranked in order of priority, roughly. So they had to do equal population in the Voting Rights Act first, and then things like nesting were down at the bottom. Something they should shoot for, but didn't necessarily have to hit perfectly. So how'd they do? Well, the equal population thing I won't even show you because that's kind of background in some sense. Like, it's an important constraint, but there was never any doubt that they would hit that pretty firmly on because the districts wouldn't go anywhere otherwise. And they did. So they were all quite equal in population. But this is showing some of the Voting Rights Act considerations. Did they do a good job with minority representation? And the answer is yes, especially for Latinos. So there were more majority Latino districts after in the final plan than there were in the 2001 plan. Now, all the way through here, when I'm showing you these outcomes, the interesting thing is that middle 2011 draft plan. That's an interesting little nuance in this process. They released that plan, and then they received criticism because there wasn't enough minority representation in that plan. And that plan, as I'll show you in a little bit, did a really, really great job on nesting. But then they ended up abandoning nesting in order to try and meet the higher ranked goal of Voting Rights Act concerns. So in that sense, they did a good job of respecting the ranking that's in the law. But quite a few more Latino districts, and then the first Asian American district. They also were not supposed to split up cities and counties. There was a modest decline in the number of counties that were split between multiple districts. So this is just looking at cities that didn't have to be split between districts. Because of course some, Los Angeles, for instance, is never going to be in a single district because that would violate equal population. So in terms of splitting cities that could be embedded within a single district, you can see that there is a modest improvement, but it's not huge. It's not quite, it's not where the main action was, but some improvement. There was a decline in counties that were split for the Senate, at least. Not as much for the others. Again, because a certain number of split counties is required in order to meet the equal population requirement. And I think that people don't quite understand that sometimes. However, here's just one measure of compactness. Again, this is trying to get at how close to a sort of a simple square or triangle or circle are the districts. This particular measure, the Polsby-Popper measure, ranges from 0 to 1. If it's 1, it's a perfectly compact district. If it's 0, it's not compact at all. And you can see that all three plans saw an improvement in compactness, or excuse me, the last two plans, the three Assembly, Senate, Congress, and then both the draft plan and the final plan saw an improvement over the 2001 plan, and a considerable improvement for the Senate and Congress. And then this issue of nesting. So this is looking at the average number of Assembly districts per Senate district. You can see in the 2001 plan there were quite a lot, which tells you that in 2001 the legislature wasn't really paying attention to this issue at all, which, you know, it wasn't a mandate of theirs. And so there were a lot of Assembly districts that crossed over into any given Senate district. In that 2011 draft plan, they got almost exactly perfect nesting. Like 3 Assembly districts per Senate district, that's pretty good. That's pretty close to perfect nesting. But then they got that pushback. And they tried to respect Voting Rights Act concerns in the final draft, in the final version, more than in the draft version. And you can see that what they sacrificed as a result was nesting. But they were making those trade-offs, and I think that was something that they were, again, mandated to do, and so it was an appropriate decision. In addition to these mandated goals, I would say that there are a couple of more sort of aspirational goals. People who pushed for this reform wanted the districts to be fair and competitive. So fair to the major parties, meaning no major gaps between the overall number of votes and seats that were won by each party. No significant disproportionality. And then competitive races in most districts. And so I'll define that here just for what I'm going to show you as races where the vote share for the major party candidates fell between about 45 and 55%. So something that could have gone the other way, potentially. So the measure of fairness I'm going to use is something that I developed called the efficiency gap. And it gives a sense of sort of how each party is wasting its votes on big wins in some races and just barely losing in others. And what you can see is here for the Assembly, that dotted line is the redistricting, that both the old map and the new map tilted a little bit Democratic, but the new map tilts a little bit more Democratic than the old one, but that dividing line for redistricting doesn't really stand out as a place where anything significant changed. So there is a slight tilt by this measure in the plan that the commission drew, but likely largely by accident. Same thing is true for the Senate. The deviations are bigger, partly because the Senate is a smaller number of seats, and so one seat changing hands can change a lot for the Senate. So there's a lot more noise here. But again, no clear shift post-redistricting. And then here's for Congress. For Congress, it does look a little bit more like it tilted more Democratic afterward. But because the overall average is close to zero post-redistricting, it's probably largely noise, but just something to flag. In terms of competition, with the exception of of 2008, where there were a lot of competitive races. In 2008, there was a big shift, but in votes, but a lot of seats didn't change hands. So you ended up with a lot of really close competitive outcomes where people almost lost, but didn't. So there were a number of competitive races in assembly in 2008, but beyond that, there is more of a clear sense that the districts drawn by the commission are more competitive than the ones that came before. Same thing roughly for the Senate, though it's not super clear. Again, that 2008 outcome really stands out. So it's a little bit noisier, and again, the Senate results are more noisy. So it's not as much of a slam dunk here, but there's a little bit. The biggest change is really for Congress, where quite clearly after the redistricting, there were more competitive races. There have been more competitive races than before. And actually, if I hadn't updated these numbers for 2018, but if I did, it would show even more competitive races. 2018 was a year with a lot of competitive races. So that gives a sense of sort of what emerged from the commission. I would say overall they respected their mandate. I have actually suggested in some published writings that the commission may want to designate some standards of competitiveness and fairness that it wants to try and hit before it starts drawing lines. And then once it draw the lines without any of that partisan information, and then after they finish drawing the lines, evaluate the plans that they drew to see how well they hit those metrics that they established up front. And that might be a good way to sort of insulate them from criticism that they may be biased in one direction or another. So I think the commission is going to be facing a lot of pressure from the outside about whether they're truly being nonpartisan. And so trying to find ways to inoculate themselves from that criticism would be valuable. So with that's all I had prepared for today. So I'm open to questions from whoever or wherever.